For those of you listening in, if you guys have questions throughout the presentation, you can use the Q&A section or the chat section to send a question. We'll be keeping an eye on it throughout the presentation, so feel free to jot it in there. I think you can also raise your hand and we can unmute you if you have a question that is easier to share, by talking. So just let us know or use that feature if you do want to ask a question. We'll give it about another 30 seconds or so, see if we have anyone else joining us, and then we'll get started. I feel like this red slide is giving me a nice glow today.
We need some color. There you go.
Mm-hmm. All right, let's go ahead and get started. We are recording this webinar, so you'll be able to watch it back if you'd like. If you're just joining us for the first time in this webinar series, my name is Haley Ruman. I'm the Professional Development Manager at Creative Learning Systems. So I manage our training, providing resources to our teachers, and just making sure that our schools are supported and using their SmartLab program to the best of their abilities. And I also have Devin with me.
Hi, I'm Devin Fosberg, and I'm the instructional coach at our main office in Longmont. I also kind of do a lot of different things, so I mostly just say I work on the academics team. Yeah, so hope you guys are ready.
Yeah, thank you guys for joining us. So this webinar series overall is really designed to help you leverage your SmartLab HQ program to support the summer school program that might be going on in your school this summer. We really want this to be a great resource to enhance your summer school program. And today we're going to talk specifically about how you can integrate that into your summer school. Some really high integration models, some that are a little easier to implement, especially if you're a new school. So we are going to chat about that. All right, so integrating SmartLab HQ into your summer school can have a lot of great benefits, including just increasing motivation and engagement. SmartLab HQ is usually the space in a building where students don't want to leave and they get really excited to go to school just to have the opportunity to be in the SmartLab. And so that can transfer into your summer school. Get kids really excited about coming, even though it's in the summer, and still have really fun learning opportunities. It can give students an opportunity to see learning in action and to give it context so that it's meaningful to them. They see how it can be used outside of their classroom. It can reinforce a lot of those concepts that students are working on in summer school, being able to practice it in the SmartLab or to discover it even. And again, just kind of the basis of our SmartLab HQ, it also really helps with developing those essential skills: communication, problem solving, critical thinking. And we know that supports other content areas. Anecdotally, I've had tons of facilitators tell me even just the simple part of learning to read directions and pay attention closely to directions is a small thing that students have learned in the SmartLab and has had big impacts in other areas because they find students just stopping and taking the time to pay attention and notice things more. So it definitely bleeds into other areas, even if the main focus is still on that essential skills and prepping kids for lifelong success. We're going to talk about a couple different integration models, and we'll talk to some of those benefits that it can specifically support. As you're listening in, you're probably going to be thinking, which one works best for me? So think about some of these questions. What are your main goals for integrating the SmartLab HQ? What learning do you want to focus on? If there's specific areas of need for your students, those are all good things to keep in mind so that you're choosing the right model that's going to reach those goals. How will you structure your summer program? Will there be time to be in the SmartLab HQ? How much time? How frequently throughout the camp or summer school program? How long does that last? And who will also be part of that? So who will be utilizing SmartLab HQ? Will facilitators be facilitating that part? Will it be classroom teachers or summer school teachers? And that's also something to keep in mind, as well as the students who are also going to be attending the summer school. Are they really struggling in math and you want to focus on math connections? Are they really developing literacy? And that's a piece, writing, reading, and communication. Is that something that you want to focus on? All good things to kind of keep in mind as we're talking through these models. And we're going to jump right in. We're going to talk about 3 different implementation models. One thing I do want to say is that our last webinar, which if you didn't catch it, it is available on the Launchpad. We'll continue to send out reminders of how you can access that. But we talked about how you can take the SmartLab learning approach and integrate it into summer school instruction, how you can use goal setting and questioning, how you can use our 5-step framework for project-based learning, and pull that into your summer school instruction without necessarily needing the SmartLab HQ resources. And that really is an additional integration model. So keep that in mind, that if your SmartLab HQ, it's just not ready to be used by students, maybe it's installing and you haven't had training yet, but you want to pull in some of those elements of SmartLab, that's a good option. Also, if your facilitator isn't able to participate as much in summer school, might not be available, your classroom teachers can access the resources that we've provided and use those to enhance their summer school instruction. So keep that in mind as kind of a 4th option out there. And then the rest of the presentation, we're going to talk about 3 different models.
Great. So these would be the 3 models that we decided to focus on. I know there's going to be a ton of different ways that you can implement it. I think just thinking through those questions that Haley kind of already went over are really going to help you guide kind of where you see SmartLab learning being present in your summer program. And so it's also thinking through, like, what does planning time look like? Who's really collaborating? Are you able to collaborate with the gen ed teacher? And just really focusing on those intended goals for implementing this summer program. So the first one that we have is the enrichment for summer school. And I kind of think of this as, this is its own curriculum, very similar to what you're going to see throughout the school year. And there's very little modification. It's really just more, this is kind of freedom for students to design their own thinking, create some sort of project, maybe like a passion project, even could be like a motivation as to coming to summer school. It's also dependent if you are thinking of this as summer school or summer camp or a summer program. There's all these different names, and I do think some of them have a different meaning. So if I have a summer camp, I may see this as like a STEM lab opportunity for them. And then the next one is the application of learning. That's more of like a performance task. So this could be at the end of a unit, and really giving students a chance of choice as to how they get to actually show what they know. And we'll go a little bit more into that over the next couple slides. And then the last one is context for learning. And so this is really, it can be seen a couple different ways, but it can be, first, maybe we come into the lab and we get to have some sort of entry event, get kids excited about what they're about to learn. Then they go back to their classroom, they get more instruction based on this, and then they come back to the lab later on and they get to explore some of those, the new instruction that you guys had, have some noticings, wonderings. Like I said, we'll go more into that model just over the next couple slides. And so the first one we'll go over is the enrichment. You want to flip it. Cool. So this is more, like I said, just very open-ended exploration. The learners are really setting those goals. It's very similar to what you're going to see as like a special or an elective. If you've done Smart Lab learning all year, I know even though the Smart Lab's been open, it might look more like second semester projects. So students are kind of making their own projects. And that Smart Lab project cycle should really be completed in its entirety. If possible, I think this also would be really effective if they're able to come to the lab on a consistent basis, maybe like 3 days a week. And they're really just being able to go through projects that they really want to do, but you're also guiding them with questions so that they're gaining the college and career readiness skills that we really want to focus on. And it's just a really good chance for them to kind of create projects that they're really interested in. Like I said, it's more Smart Lab on its own. I'm not really communicating as much with the gen ed teacher, and I want to see this as an opportunity for kids to continuously building those college career readiness and habits of mind.
So when you put this into practice, in your summer school, it might look like daily time in the Smart Lab where students have summer school kind of blocks, and then they have almost like elective blocks. I know a lot of middle school, summer schools kind of function that way, where students have core instruction, and then they have additional opportunities to engage in electives that are interesting to them. So that could be at the end of the day, beginning of the day. It could also be maybe an extension at the end of summer school where they've got time doing summer school and then they get to attend kind of Smart Lab camp. That's also an option as well. And that would use your Smart Lab HQ physical space and the resources there, just like it would kind of during the school year. Again, you'd lead students through that project cycle, as Devin mentioned, and you're going to take the typical role of facilitator guiding that learning, and your learners are going to be setting goals and purpose for their learning, completing their projects, and documenting that process. Like she mentioned, it's that open-ended opportunity for them to bring in their interests, explore their curiosities, and really have that high level of ownership over their learning. Typically, that would probably focus on essential skills. That might be your focus there, really drilling into that problem solving, critical thinking, communication, collaboration. Might be community focus, where you're giving them opportunities to solve community problems, to learn about their community, to create a project that would benefit their community. That also could be a focus of your Smart Lab integration as an enrichment program. This one is really great if you just don't have the time or resources leading up to summer school to do a lot of collaboration with your classroom teachers, especially if your lab is established, or if you've already had training, then you can implement it that way, and it really doesn't require a lot of modification. The only thing you might need to do is to determine what tools and project starters you want available to your different groups of students, especially keeping in mind that when you jump into the beginning of the school year and you've got kids in rotations, you might want to choose tools that have a larger number of project starters that they can use, so that once you jump into the beginning of the school year, it's new experiences for them. We'll also be sharing some modifications you can make that could bring a slightly new opportunity or kind of new focus for some of these project starters. That'll be in our next 2 webinars. And that can also help bring something new to your summer school experience that would differentiate it from your school year experience.
So the next one is the application of learning. And like I said before, this is more, I see it as like a performance task. So it's going to really come toward the end of a unit or a concept, thinking of how this might look. Maybe students are learning, they're getting the learning in the classroom for the most part, and they don't really have as much time in the lab. So maybe they only get to come to the lab once or twice a week, and it's towards the end of the week. And it's really just more focused around how do I demonstrate that mastery of the knowledge or skills that I've learned in a gen ed classroom? Maybe I've learned a math concept and now I get a chance to choose how I'm going to demonstrate my learning. Think of it also as kind of like scaffolding at its best, because it's really allowing for multiple entry points. So maybe you guys come up with the criteria for success as a class. You know the intended goal, you know this is what they need to have within their task, but the way that they show that can come, a variety of different ways. You could also allow for students to choose the artifact that they want to submit to show their learning. If you're thinking of using Spiro, and Spiro has to go through a certain set of angles, maybe I say you have to have one obtuse and one acute and one right angle in your design. As long as they're able to actually put in their documentation, this is how I used angles, in my maze. That could be one way that they actually show they understand what angles, the types of angles that they're using. I think the goals are just really more specific to what the teacher would want, so that they can actually use that as a piece of evidence that they've mastered learning, and really towards the end of kind of a unit or something that they've already learned at a previous time. Ooh, you're muted.
It always happens once, doesn't it? The logistics of integrating this as an opportunity for students to apply what they're learning in summer school. It's typically going to happen after that instruction, whether that's daily, they're focusing on instruction, and then they're asked to really go practice that skill or concept in the SmartLab, or whether SmartLab is scheduled as a larger chunk at the end of summer school, where they go through instruction and then have that time to complete a project and really show off all that they've learned, that week, or in that kind of cycle of days in between SmartLab visits. I would recommend having a modified project journal that students use in the SmartLab. Have an essential question that really ties in that academic concept, whether that's really focusing on writing with rich vocabulary, and your essential question is, how do we communicate ideas clearly? And they're asked to really focus on that when they're documenting in their journal. And then also figuring out how you're going to collect evidence of learning. So is that going to be recording, a conversation between students, and they are going to mark parts where they used, or like write down vocabulary that they used that was really rich, but thinking through that aspect of how are we assessing their learning? How are we asking them to demonstrate, or how are they choosing to demonstrate their learning, so that it's clear to both your students and can then be shared with their summer school teachers. The teacher's role is really going to be helping with that content. They are going to be that subject matter expert, supporting that content instruction in their summer school program or block. They might help to create those essential questions that are guiding the students when they're working on their project in the SmartLab, and also helping with that assessment piece. I always encourage students are involved in that. So if there's a student-facing rubric that you can share, that the teacher can share, to involve students in that process of monitoring their own learning. You as the facilitator, facilitators are still going to use facilitation strategies, questioning and goal setting, to focus students on that content application, and just helping them through their project completion. And then selecting some of those project starters that are going to be natural connections to academic content. As I mentioned earlier, we will be having a math-focused webinar and a literacy-focused webinar to help you identify specific project starters and some easy modifications that you can make to make sure that it's going to naturally reinforce that academic content, and have those opportunities. So that'll be kind of a little library or list of project starters that you can pull from, so that you don't have to do all the work from the ground up in selecting those projects. And again, the learners, they're applying the content, that knowledge or skills, explaining their thinking, documenting it along the way, and making sure that they're reflecting to monitor how they are applying that content. To prepare this one, you're going to have to do more collaboration with the summer school teachers. You can use the standards tracker to find some of those connections with standards that are already in our SmartLab Launchpad. Whether you kind of take on some of that work or have your classroom teachers support that, we will be providing a list of training resources that we recommend using, and that includes a tutorial on how to use a standards tracker, so you could easily share that with your classroom teachers. You'll want to prep that project journal template and identify those content connections. If you already know what needs those students are really going to have, whether it's you've got a large pocket of students who are really struggling with geometry concepts or measurement or reading informational texts, that can help you with selecting some of those project starters. So this one specifically, as Devin said, is really great to give students an opportunity to demonstrate new learning, especially if they're tackling new concepts that they hadn't either been exposed to or had a lot of success with during the school year. If they just missed a lot of instruction and they missed a whole unit, they get that in summer school, and then they have an opportunity to practice it in a real world way in the SmartLab HQ. So keep that in mind. And then again, it is going to require a little bit of prep work to find some of those project starters that align, and to have some of those questions or evidence criteria so that your students know how they're going, kind of what the expectations are for demonstrating the knowledge that you're asking them to show.
So the last model is the context for learning, and I kind of started to talk about this at the beginning. This can look, I think, a bunch of different ways, but the most important part to know is in this model, I see it as there's a lot of planning and collaboration between the gen ed teacher and the facilitator, because it's really, how do I bring SmartLab learning into context into the classroom, even if that means they're actually coming into the lab. And so it can be used as an entry event. So when I say entry event, I think of it as, how are you going to get them like sparking their curiosity on something they're about to learn? Or how do I get them excited or interested in what they're about to learn? How do I make it applicable to their lives? And they really start to generate like wonderings, curiosities. Your part in kind of that entry event in the SmartLab is more, or the facilitator, whoever it is more just, how do I create really open-ended opportunities? They're really open-ended questions. You're not really addressing any misconceptions in the moment if this is that entry event, because they're really just figuring it out on their own. They're physically touching something, playing with something, and trying to figure out, how does it work? What do I notice? And you get to actually take notes and take into consideration what are the misconceptions they already have and what's the prior knowledge they already have, which is a great way to kind of gauge like how much more front loading do I need to do. And you're celebrating their curiosity and discovery really only. So you may be kind of letting them know that this is one of the human skills, is being curious. And then you can also use it as a way to revisit the lab later on. After they've actually went back to the classroom, they started to learn more about the information that they kind of explored. They have those notes, and they're really documenting just what did they wonder, because then they could later go on to it and kind of figure out some of the answers to the questions they might have had. And they're really just, you're kind of just asking, what makes you think that, or why do you think that? You're kind of gauging how they feel about it. When they come back into the lab, they actually get to kind of apply some of that learning, but it's not really a performance task. So it's still kind of right before that performance task is, how do I actually see this in a different way? So, for example, I'm thinking of math. I've already taught students how to multiply. I've taught them standard algorithm, and there's still a good set of students that are struggling with it. Now they come into the lab, they get to kind of learn multiplication in a different way. So maybe they're choosing to use Ozobot to skip count, and they get to see multiplication that way. Gives them like a scaffold or a small group situation. When I think of the setup, maybe it's kind of stations within there. So one station is they actually get to see the information with you or a teacher, whoever's available. Then they move to the next station where they get to kind of discover. And then maybe the last station is they get to reflect. And it just kind of puts what they're actually learning into an idea where they actually can see the learning happening and kind of investigate some more.
All right, so putting it into practice. Like Devin said, we really look at this as providing the basis for learning or purpose or spark for learning. So it might be beneficial to have students either be in the SmartLab HQ or using some of the resources for that discovery, as she mentioned, and then summer school instruction piggybacking off of that. Students then see that value of, I've got these questions that I have, and now I'm figuring out the answers with my teacher. So it's making it super relevant, and it can become that cyclical process of, all right, I'm exploring, and now I'm learning something to answer some of those questions. All right, I'm planning, and now I'm learning some writing skills that are going to help me write that out more clearly. Right now I'm working on my project, and I'm learning this addition strategy to help me with this component of the project. So it definitely has that cyclical aspect and a lot of communication between the SmartLab HQ and summer school. It will require a lot of the same resources as using the SmartLab for application of learning. So curriculum, access, and all of those SmartLab HQ resources. It looks like we got a question. Demetrius, I'm gonna allow you to talk, so you should be able to unmute yourself and ask your question. All right, I think it'll work. So go ahead and ask your question if you want to share it out loud. All right, maybe we hit it on accident. I'm going to lower your hand. Feel free to send your question in the chat if you want, or in the Q&A as well. So in this model, summer school teachers are going to have a little bit of a different role. They're probably going to do more conferring with students to figure out what did they do with their SmartLab project, what questions do they have, what skills do they need in order to continue to be successful. It's really helpful if they can actually be in the SmartLab HQ so they can do some of that instruction on demand, but they can also see those opportunities to make connections with some of those skills or concepts that they know that student or that group of students needs some support with. And then they can bring it back into their summer school instruction and have those conversations to contextualize it. Like, hey, remember, you guys were working on Google Maps, and you were looking at scales and how 1 inch represented 100 miles. Like, let's continue to work on that, and let's talk about a different scenario or a similar scenario. So it really does provide that purpose for learning. As the facilitator, their role will be to help make those connections and use questioning to guide students to think about how that academic content connects to what they're doing with their projects. Having students document is great. If the summer school teachers aren't able to be in the SmartLab HQ, it's really nice to make sure that students are documenting really, frequently, but also maybe just even jotting down questions they have, or problems or challenges that they're encountering, and take that back to their summer school teacher, because then they can focus some of that instruction on answering those questions and building up some of those skills. That will require a lot more collaboration with your summer school teachers and a lot more communication throughout the summer school. So if you already have really strong collaboration among that group of teachers, then this might be a really great model for you. Also helpful if the summer school teachers can actually access the SmartLab Launchpad. They might be doing the reading portion of the Learning Launcher in their literacy block. And being able to work on, maybe it's writing skills and they're working to revise their journal and what they documented that day. So lots of movement and kind of cohesiveness between those two spaces. As you're prepping, if you choose that this is the best model for your summer school this summer, you want to create some guiding questions that are going to help prompt connections to that academic content you want to target. So if you know that addition and subtraction are going to be huge, then you might identify some of those project starters and questions that will help your students see the value of that skill and how that skill can be used. Also, just that modified journal potentially to help with that communication between summer school and SmartLab. So maybe you add a section that says questions I have for my teacher, or help I need from my teacher, additional help from my teacher in my summer school setting. That might also be helpful just to facilitate that communication and give a little more ownership to students. Again, this model is really great if you are asking students to make meaning from what they're learning. That motivation and engagement is going to be huge. If students are struggling with seeing the value and getting engaged in learning some of this content, then we're showing them why it's important and making that really have that real world application. It's also great if your students have already learned some content and they want to see it in a different way, or spark curiosity for new content, like Devin said, as an entry event. Using this approach and these resources to spark that curiosity to then drive learning.
So this is kind of like a decision map. A little bit blurry on my end, so I know we're going to try and upload this. So Haley may need some help reading some of it, but we kind of thought through the process of what would it look like for each of those models, and then how would you decide which model is best for you? And that kind of just goes back to how your summer program will be run. So maybe it's a set amount of teachers that teach all subjects. We're not really sure how it's going to look. Maybe this will help you. So it starts with the first question is, who's going to be supporting the SmartLab learning? So will that be you have gen ed teachers have access to the SmartLab, and maybe they don't have access to, like, they're the only ones going into the lab. That's up to you if you decide to let them do that. If you're not there, I was a teacher that was like, my door's locked all summer if I'm not there. And so just really having some sort of idea of what check-in, check-out system may look like. But if you answered that it would be facilitators and gen ed teachers, it would move to the arrow that says, to what degree will they collaborate? So really thinking about, will I have daily collaboration? Or the other option would be, I have minimal collaboration. So if you have the daily collaboration, meaning you really get a chance to talk to them often, maybe you get a set amount of planning time. This shouldn't be something that you're doing consistently outside of your planning time. As much as we want to say we are dedicated to the children, like, don't take as much time outside of that regular teaching time. But if you get to collaborate with them, it says what are really just the goals of the SmartLab integration, and that will kind of decide which model. So if you're trying to increase the engagement, it will end with integrate SmartLab as an enrichment, so kind of integrating SmartLab on its own. If you just want hands-on learning and you really want to reinforce the academic content, so maybe that's seen as intervention, or you want to see it as just another opportunity for them to engage with the material, that would be integrating SmartLab kind of as context learning. And then if you have if you want to provide choice for demonstrating learning, so you really just think that maybe you have some visual learners, some kinesthetic learners, some auditory learners, and you just want to have them get some choice and voice in how they decide to represent, show what they know, or represent their thinking, then it would just be the application of learning. You go back up, and you see that there's minimal collaboration. Then the other two options kind of goes back to what's the goal. If you're trying to increase the engagement and develop more essential skills, you'll still end on SmartLab as enrichment. And that's also just think about, like, are you in the lab, or do you have a lot of collaboration, but you're allowing teachers to go into the lab themselves? Then that may look a little differently. Are you just trying to provide choice? And that would be SmartLab application of learning. Having a hard time reading really small text over there.
That's right. It's a little bigger.
It's probably hard to follow because I don't have a pointer, but I'm going back to the top to the blue box. And if it's just gen ed teachers, you're still kind of thinking out what kind of support will they have. So will you have a chance to actually train them? So it says extensive training from the facilitator. Think about the amount of training that went into you really understanding your SmartLab, and could you really fit that amount of training, or at least partial training, to a gen ed teacher so that they could actually facilitate? I think the biggest thing is, how do they manage the materials? So even if they're not a great facilitator, because that takes a lot of practice and they're just starting, some sort of way to manage materials. Students are taking responsibility, they're accountable. Maybe this happens more in older setting, maybe not the kindergarten, first graders. That's really up to you. Maybe you feel that they can do it. And so it's kind of asking your goals again. Are you trying to improve the engagement? That would be more of enrichment. Are you trying to have those hands-on experiences? You're feeling they need to reinforce the academics, and that would be the context for learning. Or are you trying to provide more demonstrations of learning? That would be application. And then just the last option is if there's limited resources or training. We kind of went over this strategy last webinar, is just really just using the 5-step facilitation strategies only, the 5-step journal, the 5-step framework, just because then they kind of get an idea of what they're doing in the SmartLab, but they're not actually going in and touching all the kits. And you're really feeling like they're not going to get enough training for them to just kind of go in there. And is it really going to be helpful? Are you just giving them access to extra materials with no intended goal? So really just kind of, maybe you send them the framework, or give them these webinars, or any of the resources that we provide, and that would be just that last option. So I know it's small, probably hard to kind of follow, and so we will post this along with the rest of the resources so you can kind of go through it again.
Yeah, we'll have a PDF that we'll share. And one thing I want to add just with that, if your facilitator is unable to support the summer school for scheduling or whatever reason, they want to enjoy their summer, totally understand that as well. Even if they haven't had, the classroom teachers or summer school teachers haven't had extensive training, if they've come with their students, with their classes into the SmartLab throughout the year, if you've got an existing SmartLab, it's going to make it a whole lot easier. If your classroom teachers have seen the project cycle from beginning with Explore all the way through Share, they know how students are logging on to the computers. They understand the routines for kit management and for just use of the computers. Half the battle is already done, and all you might need to do is recommend some activities, or set some expectations for, here are some best practices. Here, I want you to fill out this log every day so that if something's broken, I know right away. You can set some of those guidelines without too much training or support needed if your classroom teachers have been really involved in your SmartLab. So keep in mind that if that's kind of how your program works in your school, then it's going to be a lot easier for them to incorporate the SmartLab as context for learning, as an opportunity to apply their learning, or just as that enrichment piece as well, if they want to give their students that opportunity to have really open-ended time to explore their interests and use their brain in a very different way than they might be using in their summer school blocks.
And these are just some resources that we made to kind of get you started on thinking how you can kind of implement this summer plan. So the first one is a project planner, and it's 2 different schedules that you might use to actually integrate either SmartLab as context for learning or SmartLab as application. And it kind of looks at 4 to 5 days. So I kind of thought through when I was a teacher, I only had about half days for summer school. So thinking through how many kids are actually going to be able to get through the lab. Like we said, if they don't have a lot of opportunities to come into the lab and it's like a drop-in, maybe that's either application or just like an entry event. It's not as much, I would say, context for learning because they're not really revisiting it, but it's getting them excited. And so that's that project planner that you can use. And then the second one is just a planner that I kind of drafted, thinking through that this would be an opportunity for you and a gen ed teacher to sit down and kind of co-create some sort of lesson. So it shouldn't be something that maybe you do on your own. They should definitely be involved because the questions that are being asked are kind of like the content skills and the standards that they want to be addressed. What does it look like for them to show mastery? What are the learning styles that might work best? And I think at the end, it kind of goes through, just some resources and materials that would be needed. So for example, if I'm doing this on my own as a facilitator, I'm not in the gen ed classroom, I shouldn't be seeking out all the resources that they're going through in a classroom setting, but maybe getting those from the teacher. And that's just one way to also bring in this idea of how do I use the project cycle no matter what subject. And so I think maybe they could continue using this after summer school, because I think it's definitely a way to make them feel like the learning is it looks the same in all my classes, and this is how I learn, this is how I problem solve. So those will be posted, and you can feel free to go through them and kind of see some examples of that.
We'll also be sharing some training resources. We have a professional development guide that's structured like an online course, guides new facilitators through our philosophy, through our 5-step framework, through the role of being a facilitator, using our curriculum, what a day in the SmartLab looks like. And that's something that you could share with your summer school teachers, especially if you're going to be integrating your SmartLab HQ as the context for learning, because they're probably going to want to be a little more familiar with the program so that you can both support each other. So we'll provide the links to that so that they can access it. It's free. All you have to do is create an account with an email address, and then they can go through the course. We'll share the tutorials for the standards tracker, some additional resources for learning how to use the Launchpad and accessing some of the tools that they might want to integrate. And then after our next 2 webinars, we'll be providing additional resources that have lists of project starters and modifications for each grade level, grade band, to help reinforce literacy and math concepts and skills. So definitely keep an eye out for those, because those are going to help significantly with your planning. Again, just a reminder, all of these resources are going to be on the SmartLab Launchpad. You'll need your admin login to get to it because it is a facilitator resource. If you feel comfortable sharing that with your classroom teachers, you can share that. There's really nothing they can mess with unless it's your Launchpad settings, and you might just tell them to stay out of that area. If you don't have your login and you need it, just contact customer support. The link is in there, so it'll be in the slides that I upload. But our email is just support@creativelearningsystems.com. And you can just email them and ask for your login, and they should be able to give it to you. There's a QR code there if that's easier to get to the resources, but it's all going to be on the same page, and we'll continue to add every week the recordings, the slides, and the resources that we've shown to that page. So you'll be able to go to the same spot every week for the new resources. Again, we're always here to support you. So if you're joining in these webinars and you have questions, or you're thinking, you know, we've got this really unique goal, what option would be the best? How could we best integrate and leverage the SmartLab HQ? You're always welcome to contact us. We're happy to give advice, to be thought partners in that. Give some, you know, experience based on what we've seen be successful. So I've put our academic services email there. It's academics@clsonline.com. But I've also put my info there, and you're welcome to contact me directly. If you guys have questions, you can raise your hand. You can submit it in the Q&A or in the chat. Please feel free to ask anything, whether it's about this integration model or just summer school in general. Feel free to add that in. But if we don't see any questions, we'll end a little bit early today, give you some time back in your day. Thank you all so much for joining us. We're really excited to see how your SmartLab HQ program is used this summer to support your summer school.
Thanks, guys.
All right, thanks. Have an awesome evening, and we'll catch you guys next week with our next webinar about math connections.
Bye.
All right, bye. Good night, everybody.